if you want to showcase your ability to universities, especially Ivy League, Oxbridge, top 30 US universities, and want to show that you have a distinctive talent and ability in writing and in creative academic things. So some basic kind of requirements for this. So it's a 2,000 word max essay. So it's not exactly a research paper. Some of you may be aware of or know about things like the Concord Review, which is a very esteemed history journal for high school students who want to publish. They take papers up to 10,000 words or even above. So 2,000 words is a little bit more modest. It means that you have to be concise. You have to express your ideas, and you have to express your ideas in a very punchy sort of way. You can still be creative, you can still do deep research, but you have to be punchy. You also are recommended to only answer one question. Theoretically, you can submit as many essays as you like, but it's always been my recommendation that you put your best foot forward by really focusing on one question and answering that one question. Okay, so how do you approach a John Locke essay competition question? So we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in a second, but just to preview some of these ideas, you need to think deeply about the question. These are really tricky questions. These are questions that are modeled in the style of the sort of the questions that undergraduate or even graduate students at Oxford or Cambridge would get. Questions that might seem quite simple or direct, but really require some thinking. And then, of course, you have to do research. You have to find sources. You have to work through them. So let's, I think, yeah, so let's talk about the specific example of unpacking a question about what it means to really dig deep into a question. So this is a sample question, I believe, from politics from last year that seems maybe really, well, quite straightforward. Diversity is fashionable, but is it valued? Right? This is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm counting right. It's a seven word question, right? If it's not, if it's actually 8 words, well, I don't teach math, right? My point is, it seems quite straightforward, right? It seems very yes or no, right? But in reality, there's a lot going on here that you really have to dig into, and that could drive your question in very different ways. So, what does diversity mean? Is diversity one type of thing? Are we talking about diversity in terms of ways of thinking, in terms of identity? And how would taking one of those definitions or the other definition or even a completely other definition change the way in which you approach your question? When it says diversity is fashionable, well, do we even agree with that for the first part? Do we want to fight the question a little bit and say, no, I don't think diversity is fashionable because of this, right? And then who decides, right? How do we understand what that means exactly? And then valuable, right? To say, is diversity valuable? Okay, well, what does it mean for a concept like that to have value? Are we talking about your own personal life? Are we talking about to society? Are we talking about in terms of economics? Does it increase GDP? Are we talking about enriching the human experience? Right? These are all potentially different and conflicting definitions. And so, how you put your own unique spin and understanding on the question will radically change um, your answer. Right? And this perhaps goes without saying, but there is not one right answer, right? They're not looking for people to say yes or no, or any other particular answer. It's all about how you engage with the question. And then, of course, there's the research, right? It's not just, sitting with the question and spitballing and saying, well, it could be this, it could be that, or that, I don't know, right? You're going to have to do creative thinking, but you're also going to have to do creative research. We want you to look at theory, right? If that's in, philosophical frameworks, famous political theories, economic models. And we want you to look at case studies, specific real world examples that will help you ground your work in a particular defined example. Okay. So now let's zoom out for a second and talk about some broad tips that I've learned over the past several years, teaching master classes such as this for the John Locke essay competition, and also working with students one-on-one throughout the entire process, from the beginning to the end. So start early. As of at least last year, the registration deadline was May 31st, and essays were due June 30th. We don't know exactly what that deadline is going to look like for this upcoming year, but it's likely to be similar. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is students starting too late. Starting, maybe they'll register in time, but they'll wait a couple weeks before and start beginning, right? And they'll start beginning a couple weeks before the essay is due. This doesn't give enough time to really dig into a question, creatively unpack it, to do the research, and then, of course, to write and revise your essay. So it's really important to give, I would say, several months of good effort if you want to be competitive in this competition. You also want to think about which question you choose. So there's 7 categories, 3 questions each, at least for the senior competition. You might want to consider selecting a prompt that matches what you've already been doing, right? You don't have to if you are really, if you read the theology question, you've never done theology before, but it just intrigues you, right? You can go for that. But you should know that you might be competing against people who have studied a lot of theology, right? Who have thought already about the issues that the question is talking about. So you're going to be facing more of a hill, right? But if you've just been studying, let's say the history of World War II, right? And there's a question about totalitarianism, right? And you say, oh my God, I just read Richard Evans' book on the Third Reich, on Nazi Germany. I can totally answer this question, and I'm ready to go. That might give you a boost, right? Um, and then we also want to talk about challenging the question, right? So we just kind of went over this, but the idea of that these Oxford style questions require you to not just rush in to say, oh yeah, I know what this answer is. I know what the value of diversity is. No, stop, unpack, think through, and then answer. You also want to read deep but smart, right? So what I mean by deep is that, especially in this age of AI, and I'm a big fan of using AI for research methods. There's still nothing to truly replace losing yourself in the topic a little bit, not too much, but a little. You have to really soak in the material. There's no shortcut to that. But then once you've soaked for a bit, once you've really gotten into the material, when you move on to your second book or your third, or maybe your second article, your third article, then you can read more selectively. You can narrow your focus. You can decide what to read more of, what to read less of. So you can be smart once you've done that initial deep getting into the topic. Uh, Create a thesis early. So you want to have a clear, concise statement that drives your paper, right? A lot of you have probably already learned about thesis statements, but it's worth going over. Uh, Creating the thesis statement early doesn't mean that you're locking yourself in necessarily, but it's a signal to yourself that you're thinking about what your argument is, what your, at least at a given moment, what your position is. And of course, your ideas will develop, and maybe you'll even do a 180, but at least marking down on the page or the virtual page what your thoughts are at a given moment, the culmination of your thoughts are, will help will help you create a more strongly analytical essay. Okay. Uh, Structure first. So some students love to just jump into writing, right? Say, okay, I've got my ideas. Boom, I'm going to write it. I kind of think of that decision as similar to a builder or an architect or whatever, who says, you know what? I'm just going to build the house. I don't need to make a blueprint, right? I'm going to figure it out as I go, right? But then that builder, maybe they make the first floor and it's okay. But then they make that second floor and they realize, oh wait, I didn't do the piping quite right, or the materials I used on the first floor, they're not going to support what I'm doing now on the second, right? And then they have to tear everything down and start again. If only they had made a blueprint, right? If they had put everything down as an idea and seen how things interacted, how things supported each other, then they could have saved all that hassle, right? So of course, I know we're not architects and builders, right? It's a little bit easier to move things around on a Google Docs or a Word page, but still creating a detailed outline where you play with structure, decide what's going to go first, second, third, and then look at it with clear eyes and see what the pros and cons of your choices are, will allow you to create a stronger uh, essay by the time you get into the actual writing. Another piece of advice, block your time. Uninterrupted sessions of, if you can do it, 2 hours, at the very least an hour, I think, will allow you to get into the rhythm of writing and research. Terrible to try to do this sort of thing in 15-minute chunks. You'll spend 5 minutes just getting into the flow, and then you've basically got, you know, no real productive. So really try to block out your schedule so you can make big chunks of progress at a time. Lastly, stay flexible, not too flexible. This is a tricky one, but we know that as you write, as you get into the writing process, new questions will emerge, right? Um, the very process of squeezing your ideas into prose, into written language, will make you think differently, will make you generate new questions. So as those happen, that's okay. You can return to research to kind of fill in those gaps. You can modify your argument if you have to, but don't be too flexible either, right? If you're always changing every time you meet any amount of resistance or any amount of new questions, new things that come up, then your paper will go all over the place and you'll never end up finishing. So you have to have this difficult balance between the flexibility necessary to deal with new things as they come up, but also staying on the path. Okay, and some last tips here. So let's talk about some ethics here. So academic integrity is really important. It's important that the work that you produce and the work that you submit be genuinely yours. Um, I know last year the John Locke Essay Competition put up their own AI policy. I'm imagining there'll be something similar this year. So you'll have to be aware of what the specifics are when that comes out. So the guidance that I'm going to give is more of my own, my own personal guidance as a practicing historian. This is the sort of the guidance that I use for my own work that I'm, writing and publishing. So making sure that you're citing your sources, right? Really important to avoid plagiarism. Um, in terms of AI can be incredibly powerful for brainstorming or processing through more data than any human could, right? And that includes the data of words, right? Um, Using it to produce the very language that you submit, that's an ethical boundary, right? It's a mix of plagiarism and some other ethical issues as well, right? So it's a problem to copy in language that's been generated by artificial intelligence. And then lastly, the role of tutors, such as myself, right? Um, So, in all sorts of academic processes at the highest level, outside help is crucial, right? From, parents and partners who revise drafts and provide ideas to academic colleagues who review things. Writing is in that sense very collaborative. When it comes to tutors and competitions such as this, it is important that you still be the one with the hand on the wheel, right? It's still your project. The tutors, such as myself, could just help you guide it a little bit, direct you one way or the other, provide advice, not writing the essay for you. And then lastly, we have revise relentlessly. So this is something else that I often see with students is, especially if you're running late, right? If you're, this is another reason why it's important to leave the time, is I see that students, submit their first draft or even their second draft, right? Maybe their first draft with a polish. Um, that's usually a mistake. Very few people are, and I am not one of them, are born with the gift of being able to write exactly what they want on the first go, right? Many of you have probably had some sort of experience in your life where you've said something out loud to a friend, a loved one, something, and as soon as you say it, you wish you could just snatch it back from the air and say, no, 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 I didn't mean that. Sorry, what I meant to say was this, right? And you can't do that when you're speaking, right? Um, and that causes problems, right? But you can do that with writing. You can make sure that when you hit the submit button, you are conveying exactly what you intend to convey. But you can't get there through the first draft, just like our speech is imperfect, right? You have to revise. You have to be critical. You have to get help. And you have to do this multiple times to cut it down, to get it to size, um, and to make it more concise. Um, on the theme of concision, um, making something brief, smaller, right? There's a famous, perhaps apocryphal quote from the famous author Samuel Clemens, more commonly known as Mark Twain. He said he was writing a letter to a friend, and it ended up being this very, very long letter. And at the end of the letter, he said, "I'm so sorry that I've written you this incredibly long letter. I would have written you a shorter one, but I just didn't have the time." Right? And at first pass, that may seem paradoxical, right? I would have written you a shorter letter if I had the time, right? Isn't something shorter going to take less time than something longer? Not necessarily, right? This is one of the things in particular that's kind of tricky about the writing process. Is it's easy to go on and on and on in an unstructured sort of way. It takes effort and it takes time to polish something down to no fluff, just what you're trying to say, just the important.